Welcome to Brain Speak Audiobooks, where great stories truly live.
I want you to picture something very specific, not a metaphor, an actual memory, because it happened to me on a Tuesday night that looked exactly like every other Tuesday night of that year. I was sitting at my desk at 11:40 in the evening. The report I needed to finish had been open on my screen since 2 in the afternoon. 9 hours. In 9 hours, I had written 4 paragraphs, deleted 3 of them, opened my email 11 times, checked a group chat about a trip nobody was planning, watched part of a video about a chess match I don't play, and read the first 2 lines of 6 different articles I would never finish. My browser had over 300 tabs open. Some of them had been open for weeks. I had convinced myself they were important. I hadn't returned to a single one. That night, I finally closed the laptop, and I sat there in the dark kitchen, and I felt something that I think a lot of people listening to this right now have felt. Not exhaustion from working too hard. Exhaustion from working so little, so inefficiently, so scattered, that an entire day had evaporated and I had nothing to show for it except the low, humming shame of knowing I had wasted something I could never get back. I want to be honest with you about what came next, because it wasn't a single dramatic turning point. There was no thunderclap of clarity. What happened instead is that I got curious about a very uncomfortable question. Why couldn't I control my own attention? I wasn't lazy. I wasn't unintelligent. I cared about the work. And yet, moment by moment, my mind kept sliding away from what mattered toward whatever was loudest, newest, or easiest. That question sent me into the research. Not self-help platitudes about willpower, but the actual neuroscience of attention, the actual behavioral science of why the brain does what it does. What I found didn't just explain my scattered Tuesday nights. It explained why an entire generation of otherwise capable adults feels like their own mind has become unreliable. And it gave me something more useful than motivation. It gave me a mechanism. A way to retrain the exact circuits responsible for focus, one deliberate rep at a time. I want to take you back to that kitchen for a moment, because I think the details matter. The dishes from 3 days earlier were still in the sink. Not because I was incapable of washing them, but because washing them required a kind of sustained intention that, by 11 at night, I simply didn't have left. My phone was on the counter, screen still lit from the last thing I'd checked. I remember picking it up out of pure reflex, not because I wanted anything on it, just because my hand had learned that reaching for it was what happened during any silence longer than a few seconds. That reflex, that automatic reach towards stimulation the instant stillness arrived, turned out to be one of the most important clues in everything I would later learn. What struck me hardest during that period wasn't the failure itself. It was how normal the failure felt. I talked to friends, colleagues, people I respected, and almost every one of them described some version of the same experience. A brilliant, capable person who couldn't hold their own attention on the thing they claimed mattered most to them. Careers stalling not from lack of ability but from an inability to execute consistently. Relationships thinning out because presence, real undivided presence, had quietly become a rare event instead of a baseline. I started to understand that I wasn't looking at a personal defect. I was looking at a widespread condition, one that almost nobody was naming correctly, and even fewer were treating with anything more substantial than generic advice to just focus more. This is not a story about becoming a monk who never checks a phone again. I still get distracted. I still lose an hour here and there to something meaningless. The difference is that now those moments are the exception, not the operating system of my life. I built a mind that can choose where it goes, instead of a mind that gets dragged wherever the loudest stimulus points. That is what this audiobook is going to give you. Not inspiration. A rebuilt attention system, based on how the brain actually works, built step by step, chapter by chapter, until the version of you who started this listening session and the version of you who finishes it are, in a very real and measurable way, different people. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something, because I think the answer matters more than you'd expect. Before we dive in, focus isn't abstract for most people. It has a face. It has a specific moment where it breaks. Drop your answer in the comments right now. What's the one task you keep avoiding? The one you open and then quietly close again? Just name the task, in a few words. I read every single one, and I promise you, You are not alone in whatever you type. If you're the kind of person who takes their mind seriously, hit subscribe. It tells the algorithm to keep sending you this kind of content, and there is a lot more of this coming. The cost of a scattered mind. Most people underestimate what a scattered mind actually costs them, because the cost doesn't arrive as a single catastrophic event. It arrives as a slow leak. A few minutes here checking a notification that didn't need to be checked. A few minutes there rereading the same paragraph because your mind had already left the room. None of it feels significant in the moment. That is exactly what makes it dangerous. Researchers who study attention have a term for what happens when you switch from one task to another: attention residue. The concept comes from the work of organizational psychologist Sophie Leroy, who found that when you move from task A to task B before finishing task A, part of your cognitive resources stay behind, still processing the unfinished task. You are never fully present in task B. You are operating at partial capacity, and you don't even realize it, because the brain doesn't send you a warning light. It just quietly performs worse. Now multiply that by the number of times an average adult switches contexts in a single day. Studies on knowledge workers have found people switching tasks, checking messages, or shifting attention every few minutes during a typical workday. Every one of those switches carries residue. Every one of those switches taxes the same limited cognitive resource. By the end of the day, you are not tired because you work hard. You are tired because your brain spent the entire day violently changing direction, over and over, like a car doing stop-and-go traffic instead of cruising on an open highway. This is the first thing I needed to understand, because it reframed the entire problem for me. I used to think my issue was a lack of discipline. What I actually had was an environment and a set of habits that were forcing my brain into hundreds of unnecessary gear shifts a day, and then I was blaming myself for feeling exhausted and unfocused, as if exhaustion were a character flaw instead of a predictable outcome of how I was treating my own mind. There's a physical dimension to this too, one that most people never connect to their focus problems. Your prefrontal cortex, the region of your brain responsible for sustained attention, planning, and resisting distraction, is metabolically expensive. It burns through glucose and oxygen at a disproportionate rate compared to other brain regions. Neuroscientist Roy Baumeister's research on self-control, though later refined and debated in the field, pointed to something real. Sustained effortful attention depletes a finite resource over the course of a day. You don't have infinite focus. You have a budget. And every scattered, reactive, notification-driven moment spends from that budget before you've even sat down to do the work that actually matters to you. Here is what nobody tells you about that budget. It's not just being spent by big things. It's being spent by small, invisible things constantly. The phone sitting face up on your desk, even when it doesn't buzz, has been shown in research from the University of Texas to reduce available cognitive capacity, simply because part of your brain is allocating resources to resisting the pull of it. You don't have to pick it up for it to cost you. Its presence alone is a tax. I remember the exact moment this landed for me. I was reading about a concept called attentional capture, the brain's automatic, evolutionarily ancient tendency to snap toward anything novel, anything that moves, anything that might signal opportunity or threat. This system kept our ancestors alive on the savannah. A rustle in the grass needed instant attention, because it might be a predator. The problem is that this exact mechanism, tuned over hundreds of thousands of years to protect us from lions, is now being triggered dozens of times an hour by a small rectangle of glass engineered, quite literally, by teams of behavioral scientists, to exploit it. You are not weak. You are not lazy. You are running ancient hardware in an environment specifically engineered to hijack it. Once I understood that, the shame started to lift, and something more useful took its place, a sense of engineering. If the problem was structural, the solution could be structural too. Let's talk about what a scattered mind actually costs you across a life, not just a day, because I think this is where the stakes become real. Cognitive scientists who study expertise, including the extensive work of Anders Ericsson on deliberate practice, have found that meaningful skill development requires sustained, focused engagement, not scattered exposure. The people who become extraordinary at anything, whether it's a craft, a profession, or a relationship, are not the people with the most raw talent. They are disproportionately the people who could sustain focused attention on the thing that mattered, for longer, more consistently, than everyone around them. which means every year you spend with a scattered mind is not a neutral year. It is a year where the compounding of skill, the compounding of deep relationships that require real presence, the compounding of financial decisions that require sustained thought, all of it is quietly being suppressed. Not dramatically. Just enough that 10 years later, you look up and wonder why you don't feel like you've built anything that matches the effort you know you put in. Consider what this does specifically to relationships, because I think this is the domain where the cost is most painful and least discussed. Presence is not a soft, sentimental idea. It is a cognitive act, requiring the same executive attention resources you'd use for demanding work. A partner talking to you while part of your mind is still processing a notification you glanced at 10 minutes earlier is not receiving your full presence, even if you believe you're listening. Children, in particular, register this with startling accuracy. Developmental research on parental attention has repeatedly found that children can distinguish between a parent who is physically present and a parent who is cognitively present, and that the latter, not the former, is what predicts the quality of the relationship over time. A scattered mind doesn't just cost you productivity. It quietly costs you the depth of every relationship that depends on your undivided attention to feel real. The same erosion happens in career trajectories, though it shows up differently. Promotions, opportunities, and reputations are rarely built on single impressive moments. They're built on a track record of reliable, sustained execution, the kind that requires you to hold a complex project in mind across days or weeks without losing the thread. People with trained attention systems don't necessarily work more hours than everyone else. They simply lose fewer of those hours to internal noise, which means the hours they do work compound into visible results far more efficiently. Over a decade, that difference in efficiency, not raw effort, is often what separates the person who built something substantial from the person who worked just as hard but has comparatively little to show for it. I want to be careful here, because this is not about guilt. Guilt is not a strategy. Understanding is a strategy. And once you understand that focus is not a personality trait you either have or don't have, but a trainable neurological function, everything changes. The rest of this audiobook is going to walk you through exactly how that training works, starting with what's actually happening inside your skull when your attention breaks, and ending with a rebuilt system you can rely on for the rest of your life. Let me give you one more piece of this, because I think it's the piece that finally made the cost feel real to me instead of theoretical. Economists who study decision fatigue have observed that the quality of your choices degrades measurably as the day goes on, not because you become less intelligent, but because the cognitive resources required for careful, deliberate decision-making have been spent. A scattered mind doesn't just cost you time. It costs you the quality of every decision made after the scattering happened. The email you sent too quickly. The comment you regret making. The financial decision you didn't think through properly. Trace enough of those moments back, and you find the same root cause, a mind that had already spent its focus budget on things that didn't deserve it. I think about a man I read about during this research period, a mid-career architect who described his own scattered years almost exactly the way I would have described mine. He said the tragedy wasn't any single bad day. It was that he could not point to a specific moment where things went wrong, because nothing dramatic ever did. He simply woke up one day, 10 years into his career, and realized that his portfolio, his relationships, and his own sense of who he was had all grown at a fraction of the rate they should have, not because he lacked ambition, but because his attention had never been fully committed to any of it for long enough to compound. That story stayed with me, because it wasn't a story about a crisis. It was a story about erosion, the kind that happens so gradually you don't notice it happening until you turn around and measure the distance. But first, you need to see the enemy clearly, not as an abstract idea, as a mechanism, which is exactly where we are going next. Why your brain craves distraction. Here's a question that used to bother me constantly. If distraction is so costly, so clearly bad for us, why does it feel so good in the moment? Why does checking the phone, opening a new tab, glancing at a notification, feel like relief instead of what it actually is, which is self-sabotage? The answer lives in a small, ancient structure deep in your brain, and understanding it is going to change the way you see every single urge to check, scroll, or switch for the rest of your life. Your brain runs on a reward system built around dopamine, a neurotransmitter that neuroscientists like Andrew Huberman have spent years explaining to the public in more accurate terms than the popular myth allows. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical most people think it is. It's the anticipation chemical. It spikes not when you receive a reward, but when you anticipate one, especially when that reward is uncertain. This is called variable reward, and it is, without exaggeration, the single most powerful mechanism ever discovered for capturing sustained human attention. Think about what a notification actually is from a neurological standpoint. You don't know what it contains. It might be something exciting, something boring, something irrelevant. That uncertainty is the exact trigger that makes slot machines addictive, and it is engineered, deliberately, into nearly every app on your phone. Your brain doesn't crave the content of the notification. It craves the resolution of uncertainty. Checking your phone isn't really about the phone. It's about closing an open loop your own dopamine system has flagged as unresolved. This is why willpower alone so often fails against distraction. You are not fighting a preference. You are fighting a reward circuit that evolved over millions of years to prioritize exactly this kind of stimulus, now being triggered artificially, dozens or hundreds of times a day, by systems explicitly designed by extremely well-resourced teams to trigger it. Telling yourself to just focus in that environment is like telling yourself to just not get hungry while sitting in a kitchen full of your favorite food, with the smell actively pumped toward you. I found something oddly comforting in this realization, and I hope you find the same thing. The problem was never a personal weakness unique to me. The problem was a mismatch between an ancient reward system and a modern environment engineered to exploit it with surgical precision. Which means the solution isn't to become superhuman. The solution is to change the environment and retrain the circuit, deliberately, using the same neuroplasticity that made you vulnerable to distraction in the first place. Let's go a layer deeper, because understanding the mechanism is what makes the tools in later chapters actually work, instead of feeling like arbitrary rules you're forcing yourself to follow. The neuroscientist Michael Merznick, one of the pioneers of research into brain plasticity, demonstrated something profound over decades of study. The brain physically reorganizes itself based on repeated patterns of attention and behavior. Neurons that fire together wire together. Every single time you allow your attention to be captured by a notification instead of returning it to the task in front of you, you're not just losing a few minutes. You are reinforcing a neural pathway that says distraction is the default response to discomfort or boredom. You are, quite literally, training your brain to be distractible, one small surrender at a time. The good news, and this is the entire foundation of everything we are going to build together in this audiobook, is that the same mechanism works in reverse. Every time you notice the pull toward distraction and consciously redirect your attention back to what matters, you are reinforcing a different pathway. You are training focus the exact same way you train distraction, through repetition. Neuroplasticity doesn't care whether you're building a good habit or a bad one. It simply strengthens whatever you repeat. This reframes the entire project of building self-discipline. It's not about becoming a different kind of person through sheer force of character. It's about accumulating enough repetitions of the behavior you want, in the specific moments where the old pathway used to win, until the new pathway becomes the automatic one. This is measurable. This is achievable. And it does not require you to wait until you feel motivated, which is fortunate, because motivation, as we'll discuss later, is one of the least reliable forces in the entire human psychological toolkit. There's another piece of this puzzle worth understanding now, because it explains why certain environments make focus feel almost effortless while others make it feel like wading through wet concrete. Sleep researcher Matthew Walker's work on the relationship between sleep and cognitive function has shown that even moderate sleep deprivation significantly impairs the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate attention and resist impulsive behavior. If you are chronically undersleeping, no amount of willpower or environmental design will fully compensate, because the very organ you're relying on for self-regulation is operating with reduced capacity. We'll come back to this, because building unbreakable focus is not just a matter of mental technique. It's a matter of treating your brain like the biological organ it is, with real physiological requirements that cannot be optimized away. For now, I want you to sit with this reframe. Distraction is not a moral failing. It is a predictable output of an ancient reward system meeting a modern engineered environment. And focus is not a fixed trait you either have or lack. It is a trained circuit, built through repetition, exactly like a muscle. Once those two ideas actually land, once you stop fighting yourself and start training yourself, Everything that follows in this audiobook becomes something you can actually execute, instead of one more piece of advice you nod along to and then forget by Thursday. There's a detail from my own retraining process worth sharing here, because it illustrates just how strange the early stages of this can feel. In the first 2 weeks of deliberately practicing catch and return, I noticed my mind wandering constantly, far more than I remembered it wandering before. It felt like things were getting worse, not better. What I later understood is that nothing had changed in the frequency of the wandering. What had changed is that I was finally paying attention to my own attention. The wandering had always been happening at roughly that rate. I simply hadn't been conscious enough of my own mental state to notice it. That awareness, uncomfortable as it was, turned out to be the prerequisite for everything that followed. You cannot train a circuit you cannot observe, and for most people, attention has been operating entirely outside of conscious observation for years. This is worth naming clearly, because if you begin practicing the tools in this audiobook and initially feel like your mind is somehow noisier or more distractible than before, that is not failure. That is the instrument finally being calibrated. Stay with it. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, one that connects everything we've covered so far. The modern attention environment isn't an accident. Entire industries have built their business models around capturing and holding human attention for as long as possible, and they have done so using teams of engineers and behavioral scientists explicitly trained in the mechanics of variable reward, novelty, and social validation loops. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's an openly discussed design philosophy within technology and media industries, sometimes referred to internally as engineering for engagement. Understanding this isn't meant to make you paranoid or cynical. It's meant to help you stop internalizing a structural problem as a personal one. You are not failing a fair fight. You are, until you apply what's in this audiobook, fighting a fight that was deliberately engineered against you by people whose salaries depend on your attention slipping. Next, I want to take you deeper into the architecture itself, into what neuroscientists actually mean when they talk about the attention circuit, because once you can see the machinery, you can start deliberately shaping it. The attention circuit. If you've ever wondered why some people seem to drop into deep concentration almost instantly, while others, maybe including you, struggle to hold a single thought for more than 90 seconds without drifting, the answer isn't talent. It's the current state of a specific network in the brain, and that network can be trained with the same precision you'd use to train a muscle group in the gym. Neuroscientists generally describe attention as the product of a few interacting networks rather than a single focus switch. The most relevant for our purposes are the executive attention network, centered largely in the prefrontal cortex, and what's often called the default mode network, which activates when your mind wanders, daydreams, or ruminates. Here's the critical insight. These two networks operate somewhat like a seesaw. When one is highly active, the other tends to quiet down. Deep focus requires the executive network to take clear control. Distraction, mind wandering, and rumination happen when the default mode network keeps reasserting itself. The problem for most people in the modern world is that their default mode network has essentially been strengthened through years of habitual reinforcement, while their executive attention network has atrophied from underuse, the same way a muscle weakens when you stop training it. Every time you let your mind drift toward worry, toward scrolling, toward the reflexive urge to check something, you are, in a very real physiological sense, giving the default mode network a workout, while the executive network sits on the bench. This is not a life sentence. It's a training imbalance, and training imbalances can be corrected. This is where a specific practice enters the picture, one that has more rigorous scientific backing behind it than almost any other focus intervention available: attentional control training, most commonly studied in the form of mindfulness meditation, though the mechanism, not the label, is what matters here. Neuroscientist Wendy Suzuki's research, along with a substantial body of work from labs studying meditation's effects on brain structure, has found that consistent practice of sustained attention exercises produces measurable changes in the prefrontal cortex and in the connectivity between attention-related brain regions. This isn't a spiritual claim. It's a structural one, observed through neuroimaging. When you practice returning your attention, again and again, to a single point of focus, whether that's your breath, a task, or a conversation, you are performing a literal repetition exercise for the executive attention network. Just like a bicep curl strengthens a bicep, an attention return strengthens your capacity to return attention. I want to walk you through the mechanics of this practice, because the mechanics matter more than the label. The exercise is simple to describe and genuinely difficult to execute, which is exactly why it works. You pick a single point of focus. You hold your attention there. When your mind wanders, and it will, because a wandering mind is the default resting state of the human brain, you notice that it wandered, and you gently, without self-criticism, return your attention to the point of focus. Here's what almost nobody tells you about that exercise. The moment where the actual training happens is not the moment of focused attention. It's the moment of noticing you've drifted and returning. That single repetition, catch and return, is the bicep curl. People who practice this exercise for even a few minutes a day, consistently, are not becoming people who never get distracted. They are becoming people who catch the drift faster and return to focus more efficiently, which, functionally, is the entire definition of a disciplined mind. This explains something that used to confuse me deeply. I used to think disciplined, focused people simply didn't experience the pull toward distraction the way I did. That their minds were quieter, calmer, less prone to wandering. That's mostly a myth. What actually differs is not the frequency of the wandering impulse but the speed and consistency of the catch and return response. Their executive attention network has simply been trained to intervene faster. There's a practical implication buried in this that I want you to carry with you through the rest of this audiobook. You do not need to eliminate distraction to become a highly focused person. You need to shorten the gap between the moment your attention drifts and the moment you notice and correct it. That gap, measured in seconds for a trained mind and measured in minutes, sometimes tens of minutes, for an untrained one, is the entire difference between the person who finishes the report by 6 and the person still staring at 4 paragraphs at 11:40 at night. Let's also talk about something the research is honest about, because I promised you honesty over hype throughout this audiobook, and I intend to keep that promise. The idea that meditation or attentional training acts like a magic bypass for focus problems has been oversold in a lot of popular content. The actual research shows meaningful, measurable, but moderate effects, and the benefits scale with consistency far more than with intensity. A person who trains attention for 10 minutes daily for 2 months will very likely outperform a person who does a single 90-minute session and then stops. This is not a hack. It is a training program, and training programs work through accumulated repetition, not through singular dramatic effort. I bring this up because I want you trusting the process laid out in this audiobook precisely because it doesn't promise instant transformation. Anything that promises instant transformation of a trained neural circuit is either lying to you or profoundly misunderstanding how the brain works. What I can promise you, based on both the research and my own rebuilt attention system, is that consistent application of what you're about to learn produces real, compounding, measurable change. Not overnight. Within weeks, if you actually do the work chapter by chapter. I want to give you a concrete picture of what this looks like in practice, because abstractions are easy to nod along to and hard to actually apply. Imagine sitting down to write, the way I was that Tuesday night. You set a single point of focus, the sentence in front of you. Within perhaps 40 seconds, your mind drifts towards something else entirely, a conversation from earlier, a task you forgot to do, an itch of curiosity about something irrelevant. In the untrained version of this moment, that drift simply continues, unnoticed, for minutes at a time, sometimes turning into a full context switch, a phone pickup, a tab opened, 10 minutes gone before you even register that you left the sentence behind. In the trained version of this exact moment, something different happens. Somewhere around that same 40-second mark, a quiet internal signal fires. Not a dramatic one. Just a small, practiced recognition. I've left the task. And instead of following the drift further, you return. The sentence is still there. The thought that pulled you away gets acknowledged, sometimes even jotted down in 2 words so your brain releases its grip on it, and your attention comes back to the page. That single return, repeated dozens of times across a session, is not a sign that your focus is broken. It is the entire mechanism of focus training happening in real time. I used to imagine that focused people simply sat down and stayed on task for hours without their mind ever leaving. Once I understood the actual mechanics, I realized that's not what's happening inside even the most disciplined minds I've studied or spoken with. Their minds leave constantly. The difference is the return happens in seconds, almost invisibly, instead of spiraling into a 10-minute detour. That is a skill. Not a personality trait. A skill, built exactly the way you're about to build it, through the specific tools in the chapters ahead. I think it's worth addressing something directly here, because I promised you honesty over hype, and this is a place where hype tends to creep in. Some popular content treats meditation or attention training as though it will eventually produce a mind that never wanders at all, a kind of permanent, effortless concentration. That is not what the research shows, and it is not what I have experienced after years of this practice. Even highly trained minds wander. The goal was never to stop the wandering completely. The goal is to shrink the gap between drift and return until it becomes small enough that it no longer meaningfully interrupts the work. A trained mind still has weather. It just doesn't let the weather dictate the entire day the way an untrained mind does. I also want to address the pace of this, because expectations matter enormously for whether people stick with training long enough to see results. The neuroplastic changes associated with sustained attentional training tend to show measurable structural differences after roughly 8 weeks of consistent practice in the studies that have tracked this most closely. That is not a long time in the context of a life, but it is longer than most people give any self-improvement effort before abandoning it. I want you to know that going in, so that if week 2 feels difficult or unremarkable, you don't mistake a normal part of the process for evidence that the process isn't working. In the next part of this audiobook, we are going to go even deeper into the chemistry of motivation itself, into why dopamine has been so badly misunderstood, and how you can work with your reward system instead of constantly fighting against it. Because once you understand that dopamine is not your enemy, but a tool you've simply never been taught to use correctly, the entire project of building unbreakable focus becomes dramatically more achievable.
Preciso expandir mais pouco para atingir o mínimo de 33.000 caracteres. Bom, 33.202 caracteres, dentro do intervalo.
Acquiesce to a party too, dopamine is not the enemy. I need to correct something before we go any further, because if I let this misconception stand, everything else I teach you in this audiobook will be built on a cracked foundation. Somewhere along the way, dopamine got recast as the villain of modern life. Podcasts warn you about dopamine hits. Articles tell you to do dopamine detoxes. The implicit message is that this chemical is out to sabotage you, and the solution is to somehow suppress it into submission. That framing is not just inaccurate. It's counterproductive, because dopamine is not optional. It is the neurochemical currency of motivation itself. Without it, you wouldn't just lose your appetite for distraction. You'd lose your appetite for everything, including the deep, meaningful work you're trying to protect. Parkinson's patients, whose disease involves the degeneration of dopamine-producing neurons, don't become disciplined, focused monks. They often become apathetic, struggling to initiate any action at all, pleasurable or otherwise. Dopamine isn't the enemy of focus. It's the engine of it. The real question was never how to eliminate dopamine from your life. It's how to direct it toward what you actually want, instead of letting it get hijacked by whatever delivers the fastest, cheapest hit. Here's the mechanism worth understanding clearly. Dopamine doesn't just respond to reward. It responds to the anticipation of reward, and critically, it responds to effort in a way most people never learn. Research on dopamine and goal pursuit has shown that dopamine release increases as you get closer to completing a meaningful task, not just at the moment of completion. This is why deep engagement in demanding work can feel genuinely rewarding, even exhilarating, once you're a few minutes into it. The problem is that most people never get past the initial resistance long enough to reach that phase, because a faster, easier dopamine source is always one tap away. This is the actual battlefield. Not willpower versus temptation in the abstract, but one dopamine pathway competing against another for the same limited attention. Scrolling offers a small, instant, low-effort hit, available in under a second. Deep work offers a larger, more satisfying hit, but it requires you to tolerate a window of discomfort first, the initial friction before momentum builds. If your brain has spent years reinforcing the instant, low-effort pathway, it will default to it every single time, not because you're weak, but because that pathway has simply been trained harder and more often. The practical implication is enormously freeing once you understand it. You don't need to fight dopamine. You need to make the dopamine pathway associated with meaningful work more accessible, more immediate, and more frequently reinforced than the pathway associated with cheap distraction. This is achieved through a principle behavioral scientists call temporal discounting management, though I prefer a simpler description, shrinking the gap between effort and reward until your brain stops treating meaningful work as a delayed, uncertain payoff and starts treating it as a source of immediate, reliable satisfaction. One of the most effective tools for this, supported by research on habit formation from psychologist B.J. Fogg, is deliberately celebrating small wins the instant they happen. Not at the end of a project. At the end of every focus session, however short. This isn't about self-congratulation for its own sake. It's about giving your dopamine system a reason to associate focused effort with reward, quickly enough that the association actually forms. Fogg's research demonstrates that the emotional signature attached to a behavior, not the behavior's objective size, is what determines whether it gets wired into a habit. A tiny moment of genuine satisfaction after 10 minutes of real focus does more for your long-term discipline than a single heroic 12-hour effort followed by nothing but exhaustion. I want to share how this played out for me directly, because the shift was almost embarrassingly simple. I started ending every focused writing session, no matter how short, by physically closing my laptop and saying, out loud, one sentence about what I'd actually accomplished. It felt silly at first, but within a few weeks, I noticed something had changed. Sitting down to write no longer felt like walking toward a wall of resistance. Some part of my reward system had started anticipating the small satisfaction at the end, and that anticipation, that same dopamine mechanism that used to pull me toward my phone, was now pulling me, faintly but genuinely, toward the work itself. This is what it actually means to work with your brain instead of against it. You are not trying to become a person without desire for reward. You are training your existing reward system to fire for the things that build the life you actually want, instead of the things that merely fill the next 90 seconds. Every tool in the rest of this audiobook builds on this single reframe, so I want you to carry it forward clearly. Dopamine is not your enemy. Misdirected dopamine is the enemy, and direction, unlike desire itself, is entirely trainable. There's one more layer to this worth addressing, because it comes up constantly in conversations I've had about this work. People sometimes ask whether the goal is to eventually feel no pull toward distraction at all, as if the endpoint of this training is a kind of neurochemical immunity to notifications and novelty. That's not realistic, and I don't want to promise you something the biology doesn't support. The pull toward novelty is ancient and it isn't going away. What changes, with consistent practice of the tools in this audiobook, is not the strength of the pull but the strength of the competing pull toward meaningful work. You're not trying to silence one signal. You're trying to amplify the other one until it can reliably compete, and increasingly win. I also want to name something the popular dopamine detox trend gets partially right, even though its framing is off. Taking deliberate breaks from high stimulation, low-effort inputs, sitting in silence, going for a walk without a podcast, spending an evening without screens, does appear to make your baseline sensitivity to smaller, quieter rewards more noticeable. This isn't because you're purging a chemical. Dopamine doesn't accumulate like a toxin waiting to be flushed. It's closer to recalibration. When your days are saturated with constant high-intensity stimulation, the comparatively modest reward of finishing a chapter or a difficult conversation can start to feel flat by comparison. Periodic exposure to quieter stretches of time restores some of that contrast, which is a genuinely useful practice, even if the popular explanation for why it works is usually wrong. The myth of multitasking. I used to wear multitasking like a badge of honor. Emails open in one window, a document in another, a call half listened to in the background. I genuinely believed I was accomplishing more by running several threads at once. It took an uncomfortable amount of research and an even more uncomfortable amount of self-observation to accept what the science had been saying clearly for years. Multitasking, in the way most people practice it, doesn't exist. What actually happens is rapid task switching, and it is measurably worse for performance than doing one thing at a time, in almost every case that's been studied. Cognitive psychologist Earl Miller's research on the brain's limitations makes this point with unusual clarity. The brain, despite feeling like it can hold several trains of thought simultaneously, has an extremely limited capacity for genuinely parallel conscious processing. What we call multitasking is your executive attention network rapidly toggling between tasks, paying what researchers call a switch cost every single time. That cost isn't trivial. Studies measuring task switching have found it can reduce productive output substantially compared to sequential, single-task focus, and the cost compounds every time you switch, not just once. Here's what makes this especially relevant to the world you're actually living in. Every open tab, every app running in the background, every second monitor displaying something unrelated to your primary task is a standing invitation to switch. You don't need to consciously decide to multitask for the cost to apply. The mere availability of a second stream of information has been shown to degrade performance on the primary task, because part of your attention is perpetually monitoring for the moment it might need to switch. This is the same mechanism we discussed with the phone sitting face up on the desk. Presence alone is a tax, whether or not you ever act on it. I want to be precise about an exception here, because intellectual honesty matters more to me than a clean narrative. There is a narrow category of tasks, usually highly automatic, well-practiced physical actions like walking while listening to a podcast, that can genuinely run in parallel with minimal cost, because one of the two tasks requires almost no executive attention. But any pairing of two tasks that both require conscious thought, writing while monitoring chat messages, reading while half listening to a meeting, drafting a proposal while tracking a group conversation, is not multitasking. It is switching, badly, while telling yourself a comforting story about efficiency. Once I accepted this, I made a decision that felt almost absurdly simple and turned out to be one of the highest leverage changes I ever made. Single tasking as a default operating mode, not an occasional discipline reserved for special projects. One task, one window, one browser tab related to that task, for a defined block of time. Everything else closed, not minimized, closed, because minimized things still occupy a kind of background attention that closed things simply don't. The results surprised me, not because the theory was surprising, but because the magnitude was. Work that used to take an entire scattered afternoon began fitting into a focused 90-minute block. Not because I was working harder, because I had stopped paying the switch cost over and over, dozens of times an hour, without ever noticing the toll it was taking. There's a deeper psychological layer here worth naming, because it explains why multitasking feels productive even though it measurably isn't. Task switching produces a sensation of business, a felt sense of motion and engagement, that single tasking sometimes lacks in the moment, particularly during the friction-heavy opening minutes of a focused session. Your brain can mistake that feeling of motion for the feeling of progress, when the two are not the same thing at all. Learning to tolerate the comparatively quieter, less frantic feeling of single-tasked focus, especially in its early, uncomfortable minutes, is itself part of the retraining this audiobook is walking you through. I want you to hold on to one sentence from this chapter above everything else, because it will save you more wasted hours than almost anything else in this entire audiobook. The feeling of being busy and the fact of being effective are not the same thing, and multitasking reliably produces the first while quietly destroying the second. I'll add one practical wrinkle here, because I know exactly what objection is forming for some of you listening right now. What about meetings, or roles that genuinely require monitoring several channels of communication at once, customer support, live operations, certain kinds of coordination work? The principle doesn't disappear in those contexts, but its application shifts. The goal becomes batching rather than pure single tasking. Instead of continuously monitoring 5 channels simultaneously, you check them in defined, deliberate intervals, fully present within each check, rather than partially present across all of them at once, all the time. Even in roles that genuinely require responsiveness, the underlying architecture of attention still rewards structured, bounded engagement over continuous, diffuse monitoring. The specific interval will differ by role, but the principle, protect blocks of undivided engagement rather than smearing your attention thin across everything at once, still applies. Building your first focus muscle. Everything we've covered so far has been diagnosis. Understanding the cost of scattered attention, the mechanics of dopamine, the myth of multitasking. Diagnosis matters, but it doesn't change anything on its own. This is where we shift from understanding the problem to actively building the solution, starting with the single most foundational exercise in this entire program. I call it the first focus muscle deliberately, because the analogy to physical training isn't decorative, it's mechanically accurate. You wouldn't walk into a gym for the first time and attempt to deadlift your body weight. You'd start with a manageable load, track it, and progressively increase it as your capacity grew. Attention training follows the exact same logic, and violating that logic, starting with unrealistic expectations, is the single most common reason people abandon focus practices within the first week. Here is the actual exercise. Choose one task that matters to you. Ideally something with a clear start and a clear stopping point. Set a timer for a duration that feels genuinely achievable, not aspirational. For most people starting from a heavily fragmented baseline, this might be as short as 15 or 20 minutes. I know that sounds unimpressive. I want you to resist that judgment, because the goal of this first exercise isn't to prove your discipline. It's to establish a clean, successful repetition that your brain can build on. During that window, you work on exactly one task. When your mind wanders, and I want to be explicit that it will, because we established earlier that wandering is the default state of an untrained mind, you notice the drift and return, without narrating a story of failure to yourself. The noticing and returning is the entire point. It is not a sign the exercise isn't working. It is the exercise. When the timer ends, you stop, and this is the part almost everyone skips, and it's the part that makes the difference between a practice that compounds and one that fizzles out. You acknowledge what you accomplished, specifically, out loud or in writing. Not a vague "that was good." A specific sentence. I drafted the opening section of the report. I read 11 pages and took notes. This closes the loop that dopamine needs closed, the mechanism we discussed 2 chapters ago, and it's what transforms a single session into the beginning of a reinforced pattern rather than an isolated event. The progression from here follows a simple principle drawn from strength training research: progressive overload, applied to attention instead of muscle tissue. Once a duration starts to feel comfortable, genuinely comfortable, not merely tolerable, you extend it, typically by 5 to 10 minutes. Not by doubling it. Dramatic jumps in difficulty are the most common reason people quit training programs of any kind, and attention training is no exception. The goal over the coming weeks is not to reach some impressive number as fast as possible. It's to build a pattern of consistent, successful repetitions that your nervous system comes to trust. I want to address something I hear often from people starting this practice, because it's a legitimate concern and deserves a real answer rather than dismissal. Some tasks genuinely require hours of continuous attention, and a 20-minute starting block seems almost irrelevant against that scale. Here's what I found, both in the research and in my own rebuilt practice. You don't need to build a single 20-minute session directly into a 4-hour session. You build many strong, clean 20-minute sessions, and over weeks, string them together into longer blocks, with brief, deliberate recovery between them. The attention system, much like a muscle, needs recovery to consolidate gains. 4 back-to-back, undifferentiated hours of forced attention, particularly early in training, tend to produce diminishing returns and a kind of mental fatigue that makes the next day's practice harder, not easier. There's one more component to this first exercise that I consider non-negotiable, and it's the removal of your phone from the room entirely, not face down on the desk, not in a drawer within reach, but in a different room altogether. Research on the mere presence effect we discussed earlier makes this almost self-explanatory. If your phone's proximity taxes cognitive capacity even when untouched, then the highest leverage single change available to you, more impactful than any meditation technique or productivity framework, is simply removing it from the physical environment where focus is meant to happen. This single change, on its own, resolves more of the multitasking problem than any amount of willpower applied while the phone remains within reach. Start small. Track your sessions. Celebrate the specific, tangible outcome of each one. Extend gradually. This is not glamorous advice, and I want to be honest with you about that, because glamorous advice is usually the advice that doesn't survive contact with an actual Tuesday afternoon. What follows in the rest of this audiobook builds directly on top of this foundation, so I'd rather you master this unremarkable first exercise completely than rush past it towards something that sounds more sophisticated. The deep work threshold. There is a specific point in any focus session, one that neuroscience can actually describe with some precision, where something shifts. The initial friction fades, the urge to check something else quiets, and the work itself starts to feel almost effortless, occasionally even pleasurable. Psychologists have studied this state extensively under the name flow, first systematically described by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and understanding how to reach it deliberately is one of the most valuable skills this audiobook can give you. Csikszentmihalyi's research identified the conditions under which flow reliably emerges: a task with clear goals, immediate feedback on progress, and a difficulty level calibrated closely to your current skill, challenging enough to require full engagement, not so difficult that it produces anxiety, not so easy that it produces boredom. When these conditions align, self-consciousness fades, time perception distorts, and sustained attention becomes, counterintuitively, easier to maintain than it was in the fragmented first few minutes. Here's the detail that matters most for our purposes. Flow doesn't arrive at the start of a session. It arrives after a threshold, typically requiring somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes of uninterrupted engagement before the deeper state activates. This explains something crucial about why fragmented work, the kind most people default to, is so much less satisfying and so much less productive than sustained work, even when the total time invested is identical. If you're interrupted every 8 or 10 minutes, whether by a notification, a self-initiated check, or a context switch, you never cross the threshold. You spend your entire day in the friction-heavy opening phase of focus, without ever reaching the phase where focus becomes genuinely rewarding and efficient. This reframes interruption as a far more expensive event than it appears to be in the moment. A 2-minute distraction doesn't just cost you 2 minutes. If it happens during the pre-threshold window, it can reset the clock entirely, meaning the 15 to 25 minutes of accumulated momentum toward flow are lost, and the next attempt has to rebuild that momentum from zero. Research on interruption recovery in knowledge work has found that returning to full task engagement after even a brief interruption can take considerably longer than the interruption itself. The math here is unforgiving. A handful of 2-minute interruptions can quietly consume the majority of a working session's actual depth, even though the interruptions themselves accounted for only a few minutes of clock time. The practical takeaway is direct. Protecting the first 20 minutes of a focus session matters more than protecting any other 20-minute stretch of your day. This is where the tools from the previous chapter, the removed phone, the single task, the closed tabs, earn their value most concretely. They exist specifically to protect this fragile, threshold-crossing window, because everything valuable that follows depends on getting through it intact. I want to share what crossing this threshold actually felt like for me, once I started protecting it deliberately, because I think the sensation itself is worth naming. There's a specific moment, usually somewhere around the 18 or 20-minute mark of an uninterrupted session, where the effort of staying on task suddenly decreases, almost like a current catching a sail. The work stops feeling like something I'm forcing myself through and starts feeling like something I'm genuinely inside of. I used to assume this feeling was reserved for naturally gifted, uniquely passionate people. It isn't. It's a threshold effect, available to essentially anyone willing to protect the 15 or 20 minutes required to reach it. There's a final piece worth adding here, because it connects directly back to the dopamine chapter. Flow states are associated with a distinct neurochemical profile, involving not just dopamine but norepinephrine and other compounds that together produce the sense of effortless engagement people describe. This state cannot be accessed on demand through willpower alone. It has to be earned by crossing the threshold first, which is precisely why the unglamorous discipline of protecting an uninterrupted opening window matters so much more than any single technique applied in isolation. Master the threshold, and depth becomes available to you on a near-daily basis. Ignore it, and you will spend your entire working life in the friction zone, wondering why focus always feels like a fight. When willpower runs out. I want to address something directly, because I think it's one of the most liberating pieces of information in this entire audiobook, and one that almost nobody explains clearly. Willpower is not a character trait. It behaves, according to a substantial body of research, more like a finite resource that depletes across the day and needs to be managed strategically rather than simply summoned through greater effort. The foundational research here, associated with Roy Baumeister's work on ego depletion, has been refined and debated since its original publication, and I want to be honest with you about that debate rather than presenting outdated certainty as settled fact. Some replication attempts have found smaller effects than the original study suggested, and the field has moved toward a more nuanced view. Willpower depletion appears real but is influenced heavily by belief, blood glucose regulation, motivation, and the specific nature of the tasks involved, rather than being a simple, fixed tank that empties at a constant rate for everyone. What remains well supported across this more careful body of research is the practical observation nearly everyone recognizes from lived experience. The quality of your self-control and decision-making tends to be measurably better earlier in the day, before it has been repeatedly drawn on, than it is late at night after a long sequence of decisions and resisted temptations. This has a direct, actionable implication that most focus advice completely ignores. If willpower functions even partially like a depletable resource, then the sequencing of your day matters enormously. The habit formation researcher Wendy Wood's extensive work on behavior change has found that people who rely heavily on willpower to resist temptation throughout the day consistently underperform people who structure their environment so that willpower is rarely required in the first place. This is a profound reframe. The goal isn't to build a bigger willpower reserve through sheer grit. The goal is to need less of it, by placing your most demanding, most important focused work during the window when your self-regulation is naturally strongest, and by removing as many willpower-draining micro-decisions and temptations from your environment as possible before that window begins. I restructured my entire working life around this single insight, and it remains one of the highest leverage changes I've made. My most cognitively demanding work happens within the first 2 to 3 hours after I wake, before email, before messages, before any of the dozens of small decisions that accumulate and quietly draw down the same reserve I need for real focus. This isn't a rigid rule that applies identically to every person's chronotype. Some people's natural peak alertness genuinely arrives later in the day, and research on individual chronotypes supports tailoring this to your own biology. But the underlying principle holds regardless of when your personal peak occurs. Identify your window of highest natural self-regulation and protect it fiercely for the work that matters most, rather than spending it on email and small administrative decisions that could just as easily happen later when your reserve is already lower. There's a second implication worth naming, because it explains why so many well-intentioned focus attempts collapse by mid-afternoon. Every small decision you make throughout a day, what to wear, what to eat, how to phrase a message, whether to answer a call, draws from a shared pool of regulatory capacity. This is sometimes called decision fatigue, and it means that a day cluttered with unnecessary micro-decisions leaves measurably less capacity available for the decisions and focus that actually matter. Reducing unnecessary daily decisions, simplifying routine choices like meals or clothing, isn't a quirky productivity hack reserved for famous executives. It's a direct application of protecting a limited regulatory resource for the tasks that deserve it most. I want to close this chapter with the reframe that matters most. If you've ever felt like a failure for losing focus by 3 in the afternoon, I want you to release that entirely. You didn't fail. You spent a resource that everyone spends, at a rate influenced by how many decisions, temptations, and interruptions you absorbed earlier in the day. The solution was never to become a person with infinite willpower. No such person exists. The solution is to build a life and an environment that requires less of it, and to place your most important focused work during the specific window where your natural capacity is highest. There's a physiological piece worth adding before we move on, because it's practical and frequently overlooked. Blood glucose regulation appears to play a genuine role in the subjective experience of willpower depletion, though the relationship is more nuanced than the old sugar equals self-control narrative suggested. Stable blood sugar, achieved through balanced meals rather than the spikes and crashes of high-sugar snacking, correlates with more consistent self-regulation across the day. This isn't a license to treat sugar as fuel for discipline. That pattern tends to produce the opposite effect once the crash arrives. It's an argument for treating your body's basic physiological maintenance, food, hydration, sleep, as part of your focus infrastructure rather than a separate concern unrelated to your ability to concentrate. A brain running on erratic blood sugar and 4 hours of sleep will underperform against even the best designed attention training program, because the hardware itself is compromised before the software ever gets a chance to run. Designing an environment that thinks for you. I want to introduce a principle in this chapter that, more than any single technique in this audiobook, determines whether everything you've learned so far actually holds up under the pressure of a real, chaotic week. The principle is simple to state and profound in its implications. Willpower is unreliable, but environment is not. If you design your physical and digital environment correctly, it will produce disciplined behavior even on the days your motivation is nowhere to be found. This idea draws heavily from behavioral economics, particularly the concept of choice architecture, popularized in research by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which demonstrates that small changes in how options are presented and how much friction stands between you and a behavior dramatically shape which behavior actually occurs, often far more powerfully than conscious intention does. The applications for focus are direct and, once you see them, almost obvious. Consider friction in both directions. For behaviors you want less of, checking your phone, opening distracting apps, switching tabs, your job is to add friction. Not eliminate the possibility entirely, which is often unrealistic, but add enough small obstacles that the automatic, low-effort reach becomes a deliberate, effortful choice instead. Logging out of distracting sites so a password is required. Using app blockers during defined focus windows. Physically removing the phone from the room, as we discussed earlier, rather than merely silencing it. Each of these interventions works not by requiring more willpower, but by requiring less of it, because the automatic pathway now has a speed bump where it used to have a straight, frictionless line. For behaviors you want more of, deep work, reading, the specific focus task in front of you, your job is to remove friction. Have the document already open before you sit down. Have the book already on the desk instead of on a shelf across the room. Reduce the number of steps between the intention to focus and the actual beginning of focused work to as close to zero as possible. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because research on habit initiation has consistently found that the primary barrier to starting a desired behavior is rarely a lack of motivation. It's the friction, often trivially small friction, standing between the intention and the first physical action. I want to walk you through what this looked like when I rebuilt my own environment, because the specifics matter more than the abstraction. I removed social media apps from my phone entirely, not hidden in a folder, removed, requiring a deliberate browser login to access them at all. I moved my phone charger to a room other than my workspace, so charging it became physically incompatible with having it nearby. I set my computer to open directly into the document I was working on, rather than a browser or a desktop full of icons. None of these changes required discipline in the moment they mattered. They required discipline exactly once, during the setup, and then the environment itself did the disciplined work automatically, every single day afterward, without me having to resist anything. This is the deepest insight in this chapter, and I want you to carry it forward through everything that remains in this audiobook. Disciplined people are not, in most cases, people with extraordinary reserves of willpower. They are, disproportionately, people who have engineered environments that make the disciplined choice the path of least resistance, and the undisciplined choice the path requiring conscious, deliberate effort to access. You are not behind because your willpower is weaker than theirs. You are behind, if you are behind at all, because your environment has been quietly working against you, and nobody ever taught you that the environment was something you were allowed to redesign. I want to leave you with a practical starting point before we move into the second half of this audiobook, because I think the sheer number of possible environmental changes can feel overwhelming if you try to implement all of them at once. Pick one friction point to add and one friction point to remove this week. Nothing more. Perhaps the phone leaves the workspace entirely, and the document you're working on stays open and visible instead of buried behind other windows. That's enough for 1 week. The environments that hold up over years are rarely built in a single dramatic overhaul. They're built the same way the attention circuit itself is built, through small, consistent, compounding adjustments that eventually add up to something that looks, from the outside, like extraordinary discipline, but felt, from the inside, like simply removing one obstacle at a time. Everything we've built so far works well under relatively controlled conditions. A quiet morning, a manageable task list, an environment you've had time to redesign. But real life doesn't often hand you controlled conditions. It hands you a deadline moved up by a week, a crisis that demands immediate attention, a day that falls apart by 9 in the morning and never quite recovers. This chapter is about what happens to your trained attention system when pressure enters the picture, because pressure changes the rules, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. There's a well-documented relationship in performance psychology between arousal, the body's level of physiological activation, and performance, first described by researchers Robert Yerkes and John Dodson over a century ago and refined considerably since. The relationship isn't linear. Performance improves as arousal increases, up to a point, after which additional pressure or stress begins to degrade performance rather than enhance it. This inverted U pattern explains something almost everyone has experienced but rarely names correctly. A moderate deadline can sharpen focus remarkably, while an overwhelming one can shatter it entirely, sending you into the exact scattered, reactive state we spent the first half of this audiobook diagnosing. The practical question, then, isn't how to eliminate pressure, which is neither possible nor even desirable, since some pressure genuinely improves performance. The question is how to stay on the productive side of that curve when circumstances push you toward the edge. The trained attention system you've been building throughout this audiobook gives you a specific advantage here that an untrained system doesn't have: a faster, more automatic catch-and-return response. Under pressure, an untrained mind doesn't just wander toward mild distraction. It often spirals, one anxious thought triggering another, a growing loop of rumination that consumes far more cognitive resources than the actual problem requires. A trained mind, having practiced noticing drift and returning attention hundreds or thousands of times in calmer conditions, can apply that same mechanism to anxious spiraling, catching the loop earlier and redirecting attention back toward the next concrete action, rather than getting pulled fully into the spiral. I remember a specific moment where this became undeniably real to me, rather than a theory I'd read about. A project I'd been leading collapsed with almost no warning, a partner pulling out days before a deadline that couldn't move. The old version of me would have spent the first several hours in a fog of catastrophizing, checking email obsessively, rereading the same 3 sentences of a recovery plan without absorbing any of them. What actually happened instead surprised me. I noticed the spiral starting, the same way I'd learned to notice a wandering mind during a 20-minute focus block, and I redirected, not by suppressing the fear, but by returning attention to the single next concrete step. Then the step after that. The fear didn't disappear. It simply stopped being the thing directing my attention, moment to moment, which turned out to be the entire difference between panic and effective action under real pressure. There's a specific technique worth naming here, drawn from research on stress inoculation and used extensively in fields where performance under extreme pressure is a matter of survival, including surgical training and emergency response. The technique involves narrowing your attentional field deliberately during high-pressure moments, consciously shrinking your focus from the entire overwhelming situation down to the single next physical action required. Surgeons under crisis conditions are trained to think not in terms of the patient is dying, but next suture. Not because the larger stakes don't matter, but because attention spent on the overwhelming totality of a crisis is attention not spent on the specific action that actually changes the outcome. This same narrowing works remarkably well in everyday high-pressure moments, a critical deadline, a difficult conversation, a financial decision under time constraint. Name the single next action. Direct your entire trained attention there. Let the next action follow only once the current one is complete. I also want to address something that pressure reveals with unusual clarity. The environmental design work from earlier chapters matters even more, not less, when stress is high. This runs counter to the intuition many people have, which is that under real pressure, structure and ritual feel like a luxury you don't have time for. The opposite is true. Decision fatigue and depleted willpower, the very resources pressure consumes fastest, are exactly what your environmental scaffolding was built to protect. If your phone is already out of the room, you don't have to resist checking it while also managing a crisis. If your first task of the day is already decided the night before, you don't have to make that decision while your regulatory capacity is already strained. The systems you build during calm periods are precisely what carry you through the periods that aren't calm, which is the entire argument for building them now, before you need them, rather than waiting for a crisis to force the issue. There's one more layer worth adding before we move on, because it's counterintuitive and genuinely useful. Some degree of physiological stress response, the same arousal that can degrade performance past a certain threshold, is also what produces the heightened alertness and narrowed focus that elite performers describe during their best work. The goal isn't to eliminate this activation. It's to stay within the range where it sharpens rather than shatters attention, and the primary lever for staying in that range, according to research on stress regulation, is perceived control. The narrowing technique described above, focusing on the single next action rather than the entire overwhelming situation, works in large part because it restores a sense of control over something, even when the larger circumstance remains genuinely uncontrollable. This is a skill, like everything else in this audiobook, and it strengthens with deliberate practice, ideally practiced first in moderate pressure situations before you need to rely on it during a genuine crisis. I want to add one more practical distinction before we move on, because pressure doesn't always announce itself as a single dramatic crisis. More often, it arrives as chronic, low-grade background stress, an accumulating sense of being behind that never quite resolves into a single identifiable emergency. This kind of pressure is, in some ways, harder to manage than an acute crisis, precisely because it doesn't trigger the same clear signal to narrow focus and act. It simply erodes, quietly, the same way a scattered mind erodes a life, one unremarkable day at a time. The tools remain the same: protect the threshold window, narrow to the next concrete action, lean on the environment rather than raw willpower, but applying them under chronic pressure requires more deliberate intention, because nothing about the situation forces your hand the way an acute crisis does. If you notice a persistent, low-grade hum of overwhelm rather than a single sharp crisis, treat that as exactly the signal to return to the fundamentals covered earlier in this audiobook, rather than waiting for circumstances to force a reckoning. From discipline to identity. There's a distinction in behavioral science that changes everything about how sustainable a disciplined practice turns out to be, and it's a distinction almost nobody explains clearly when they talk about building better habits. The distinction is between outcome-based motivation and identity-based motivation, and understanding it is what determines whether the focus training in this audiobook becomes a temporary project you eventually abandon, or a permanent feature of who you are. Habit researcher James Clear, building on decades of behavioral science research, has articulated this distinction with particular clarity. Most people try to change their behavior by focusing on outcomes. I want to write a book. I want to lose weight. I want to build unbreakable focus. Outcomes are useful for setting direction, but they are a weak foundation for sustained behavior change, because outcomes are, by definition, not yet achieved. They live in an uncertain future, and motivation anchored entirely in an uncertain future tends to erode the moment the present moment becomes difficult, which, in any meaningful pursuit, it eventually will. Identity-based motivation works differently. Instead of asking what you want to achieve, you ask what kind of person does the behavior you're trying to build. Not I want to focus better, but I am someone who protects their attention. This shift sounds subtle, almost like a semantic trick, but the research on self-concept and behavior suggests it's far more than that. Once a behavior becomes tied to your sense of identity, rather than remaining a discrete task you're forcing yourself through, the psychological cost of skipping it changes entirely. Skipping a task feels like a minor inconvenience. Acting against your own identity feels like a genuine internal conflict, and humans are remarkably motivated to resolve that kind of dissonance in favor of consistency with who they believe themselves to be. I want to walk you through how this played out in my own retraining, because the shift happened gradually and then, in retrospect, all at once. For the first several months of practicing the tools in this audiobook, focus felt like a task list. Remove the phone. Set the timer. Notice the drift. Return. It worked, but it required conscious effort every single time, a kind of ongoing negotiation with myself. Somewhere around the fourth or fifth month, something changed, not in the mechanics, which stayed identical, but in how the mechanics felt. I stopped thinking of myself as someone trying to focus better and started, almost without noticing the transition, thinking of myself as someone who simply protects their attention, the same unremarkable way I think of myself as someone who brushes their teeth or locks the front door. The behavior hadn't changed. My relationship to the behavior had. This matters enormously for how you should think about the practices in this audiobook going forward. I don't want you treating them as a 30-day challenge with a finish line, after which you return to your old scattered patterns. I want you treating each small, successful repetition, each 20-minute block completed, each phone left deliberately in another room, as a vote for a specific identity you're constructing, one action at a time. Every focus session isn't just producing the immediate output of that session. It's casting a vote for I am someone who finishes what they start, and votes, repeated enough times, become the identity itself, not a description of an ideal you're chasing, but an accurate description of who you've actually become. There's a specific piece of research worth mentioning here, because it addresses a question that comes up constantly. How many repetitions does it actually take for a behavior to feel like identity rather than effort? Popular culture often cites a specific number of days, but the actual research on habit automaticity, conducted by researcher Philippa Lowley and colleagues, found something more nuanced. The time required for a behavior to become automatic varies considerably depending on the complexity of the behavior and the consistency of practice, ranging widely across the study's participants, with more complex behaviors taking meaningfully longer than simple ones. The honest answer is that there's no universal magic number, and I'd rather give you an honest, variable timeline than a falsely precise one that sets you up to feel like a failure if your own experience doesn't match a specific day count you read somewhere. What matters far more than the exact number of days is the consistency of the repetition and the presence of the identity-based framing alongside it. A person repeating a behavior mechanically, purely for the outcome, tends to abandon it the moment the outcome feels distant or the effort feels inconvenient. A person repeating the same behavior while consciously reinforcing, "This is who I am becoming," tends to persist through exactly those difficult stretches, because the behavior has stopped being a means to an end and started being an expression of identity, which is a fundamentally more durable source of motivation than any specific outcome could ever provide. There's a practical way to apply this that I want to leave you with, because abstractions about identity are easy to agree with and hard to actually operationalize. After each focus session, however brief, I want you to add a single sentence, silently or out loud, that names the identity rather than just the outcome. Not just "I finished that section," but "That's who I am," someone who finishes what they start. It will feel awkward, even performative, at first. That discomfort fades faster than you'd expect, and what replaces it is something genuinely durable, a growing body of evidence, accumulated through your own direct experience rather than borrowed from anyone else's story, that the identity you're claiming is actually, verifiably, becoming true. The compound effect of a trained mind. I want to zoom out now, further than any single chapter has allowed so far, because the tools we've covered, the catch and return practice, the environmental redesign, the threshold protection, the identity shift, only reveal their true value across time, and I think it's worth being explicit about what that compounding actually looks like, because the early stages of this work can feel deceptively unremarkable. There's a concept from behavioral economics and habit research that applies with unusual precision here: the aggregation of marginal gains, a principle made famous through its application in elite sports performance, where a series of small, individually insignificant improvements, each worth perhaps a fraction of a percent, compound into a dramatic overall gain when sustained and stacked together over a long enough period. A 20-minute focus session feels almost trivially small on the day you complete it. It does not feel like the beginning of a transformed life. But mathematics doesn't care how a single day feels. 20 focus minutes, 5 days a week, compounds into over 80 hours of genuinely protected, high-quality attention across a single year, hours that would otherwise have been lost to the kind of fragmented, residual-laden switching we described in the earliest chapters of this audiobook. But the real compounding isn't just additive, more focused hours simply stacking on top of each other. It's multiplicative, because the quality of what those hours produce compounds as well. Recall the research on deliberate practice and expertise development discussed earlier. Skill acquisition depends heavily on sustained, focused engagement rather than scattered exposure. A year of protected, high-quality focused hours doesn't just produce more output than a year of fragmented attention. It produces qualitatively better output, because sustained focus is precisely the condition under which genuine skill develops, the kind of skill that opens doors scattered effort never reaches, regardless of how many total hours were technically logged. I want to make this concrete with a comparison, because abstractions about compounding are easy to nod along to and hard to feel the weight of. Consider two people starting from the same baseline skill level in any demanding pursuit: writing, a technical craft, a creative practice. One person works in a fragmented way, switching tasks every few minutes, never crossing the deep work threshold we discussed earlier, producing a large volume of shallow, low-quality effort. The other works in focused, protected blocks, crossing the threshold regularly, producing a smaller volume of effort that is disproportionately higher in quality because it was produced under the conditions where genuine skill actually develops. Across a single month, the difference between these two people might be barely noticeable to an outside observer. Across 5 years, the gap becomes almost impossible to close, not because of some dramatic difference in talent or opportunity, but because one person was compounding quality on top of quantity every single day, while the other was accumulating volume without the depth required to convert that volume into genuine capability. This is, I think, the most important reframe in this entire audiobook, so I want to state it plainly. The tools you've learned here will not transform your life in a week, and I'd be lying to you if I suggested otherwise. What they will do, reliably, measurably, and increasingly, is compound. The version of you who commits to 20 protected minutes today is not dramatically different from the version who doesn't. The version of you who commits to 20 protected minutes most days, for a year, for 3 years, for a decade, becomes an almost unrecognizably different person, not through any single transformative moment, but through the same unglamorous, repeated mechanism that built every meaningful capability anyone has ever developed. Consistent, protected, high-quality repetition, compounding quietly in the background of an ordinary life, until one day you look up and realize the distance you've traveled. I want to leave you with one final piece of honesty before we move into the closing chapter of this audiobook, because I think it matters more than any single technique we've covered. There is no point at which this work becomes finished, no final threshold beyond which distraction stops being a temptation and focus becomes permanently effortless. What changes, with consistent practice, isn't the presence of the pull toward distraction. It's your relationship to that pull, and your capacity to notice it, and return, faster and more reliably than you ever could before. That is not a limitation of this work. It is the entire realistic, honest, sustainable shape of what building a disciplined mind actually looks like, and it is more than enough to build the life you're actually trying to build. I also want to name a failure mode worth watching for as the compounding begins to take hold, because success brings its own risks. As focus improves and momentum builds, there's a temptation to abandon the very structures that made the improvement possible: the protected morning window, the phone left in another room, the single-tasking default, on the theory that you've now graduated and no longer need the scaffolding. This is, almost without exception, a mistake. The scaffolding didn't just help you get here. It's what keeps you here. Elite performers in virtually every domain, athletes, musicians, surgeons, don't abandon their fundamentals once they reach a high level of skill. They protect those fundamentals more rigorously, precisely because they understand how much of their capability depends on maintaining the conditions that built it. Treat your environmental design and your protected focus windows the same way. Not as training wheels to eventually discard, but as permanent infrastructure, the quiet architecture underneath everything you go on to build. The mind you chose to build. I want to bring you back to that kitchen one more time, because I think you'll hear it differently now than you did at the start of this audiobook. 11:40 at night. 300 tabs. 4 paragraphs written and 3 of them deleted. A version of me who genuinely believed that his own mind had become something he could no longer trust, no longer direct, no longer rely on for the things that actually mattered. I want to tell you what changed, not in some abstract sense, but concretely, because I think concrete details matter more than inspiring generalizations at this point in the journey. My evenings look different now. Not because I found some reserve of willpower the old version of me lacked, but because the environment stopped fighting me, because the attention circuit itself got stronger through hundreds of small, unremarkable repetitions, because focus stopped being something I had to force and became, gradually, something closer to a trained instinct. The dishes get washed the same day, most days, not because washing dishes matter symbolically, but because a mind that isn't scattered by the end of the day has resources left over for the small, unglamorous responsibilities that used to feel impossible by 11 at night. I still get distracted. I want to say that clearly one more time, because I don't want the ending of this audiobook to sound like a fairy tale with a permanently resolved conflict. There are still days where my attention slips, where I catch myself reaching for my phone out of the same old reflex, where a focus session gets interrupted and the threshold never gets crossed. The difference, the entire difference this audiobook has been building toward, is that those moments are no longer the operating system of my life. They're the exception, noticed quickly, corrected quickly, absorbed into a system resilient enough to bend without breaking. Think back to the question I asked you at the very beginning of this audiobook, the task you named in the comments, the one you kept opening and quietly closing again. I want you to hold that task in mind right now, because everything in between, the neuroscience of attention residue, the truth about dopamine, the myth of multitasking, the deep work threshold, the identity shift, all of it exists for exactly one purpose: to give you the mechanism to finally close that loop, not through more willpower, but through a rebuilt system that makes finishing what you start the natural, trained, default behavior of your mind. The task you named is still there, waiting, the same way my report was still there that Tuesday night. But you are not the same person who opened this audiobook. You now understand why your attention drifted, and more importantly, you understand exactly how to bring it back, faster and more reliably than ever before. You understand that distraction was never a character flaw, that willpower was never the whole answer, that discipline is not a trait you either have or lack, but a trained circuit, built one deliberate repetition at a time, exactly the way you've been building it, chapter by chapter, throughout everything you just listened to. Go back to the comments if you haven't yet, and tell me what that task is, the one you've been avoiding. I want to know where you're starting from, and more than that, I want you to have it written down somewhere, a marker of the exact moment this began, so that when you look back on it later, after the 20-minute sessions have compounded into something larger, you'll have a precise record of the distance you traveled, starting from tonight. I think about that Tuesday night often, not with shame anymore, but with something closer to gratitude. That exhausted, scattered version of me, sitting in a dark kitchen at 11:40, staring at 4 paragraphs and 300 open tabs, is the reason everything in this audiobook exists. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't broken. He was running an untrained attention system in an environment engineered to exploit exactly that lack of training, the same environment you're running yours in right now, tonight, wherever you happen to be listening to this. The only difference between him and the person I am now isn't talent or willpower, or some fortunate break he never got. It's several years of small, unremarkable, deliberately protected repetitions, the exact repetitions laid out for you across everything you just listened to. You don't need to become a different person to build this. You need to become a slightly more consistent version of the person you already are, one 20-minute session at a time, one removed phone at a time, one protected morning at a time, until the compounding described in the previous chapter starts doing the work that willpower alone was never going to do for you. That's not a small promise. It's a precise, honest, well-supported one, and it's now yours to test against your own life, starting with whatever task you named a few chapters ago. And if this changed the way you think about your own mind, even slightly, subscribe. Not because a channel needs support, but because building a disciplined, trained, unshakable mind is not a single audiobook's worth of work. It's an ongoing practice, and there's a great deal more of this waiting for you, built the same way everything in this one was, carefully, honestly, and with the deep respect your attention, the most valuable resource you have, actually deserves. The mind you have right now is not fixed. It was never fixed. It was only ever waiting for someone to hand you the mechanism, and now you have it. What you build with it from here is entirely, finally, yours to decide.